This video will help you correctly name a trust as your retirement account beneficiary. If you don't know who I am, my name is Chris Dime. I'm a certified financial planner out of Edmonds, Washington, and I specialize in working with folks to and through retirement. As we've covered in some past videos relative to naming beneficiaries on retirement accounts, aka the person that will get the money once you're long gone, people will typically name individuals as their beneficiaries. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. However, sometimes people will want a little bit more control over these assets after they're gone. Either way, naming an individual or a trust as a beneficiary on a retirement account is a great way to avoid probate and ensure that the person you want to get the money gets the money. Otherwise, there's a chance if we don't name beneficiaries that this account will go through probate and who you want to get the money ultimately might not get it. In some circumstances, leaving money to someone, especially large sums of money, could actually do them more harm than good. And in those situations, it makes sense to look into naming a trust as a beneficiary. That said, there's some certain rules and trust language to follow to make sure that this doesn't get messed up, and so we'll cover that in today's video. So let's jump in. Now, before we get started, I want to clarify, I am not a licensed estate planning attorney. I don't have my JD, nor am I authorized to sign and enforce legal documentations, especially when it comes to someone's estate. Now, I am an accredited estate planner according to the National Association of Estate Planners and Counsels, which means I might know a thing or two about a thing or two when it comes to estate planning. Technically, when it comes to enforcing documentations, getting things drafted and implemented, I'm always going to refer clients to a licensed estate planning attorney. With that out of the way, let's talk about trusts. So why would you ever name a trust as a beneficiary as opposed to giving somebody the money outright? Well, the simple answer is you want more control over these, but the other answer could be you want to protect the beneficiary from themselves. I think we can all imagine examples where if you give someone unfettered access to a large pot of money, they might actually do more harm to themselves than good. One situation might be if the person you want to give the money to has a history of making very unfortunate financial decisions. Another situation could be where maybe you fully trust the person that you want to give all the money to, but they're married to someone that you don't fully trust to make good informed decisions. And once the spouse gets wind of their spouse coming into a bunch of money, they might be more incentivized to make very bad financial decisions. In addition, there's situations where maybe someone doesn't even have a history of making any financial decisions, aka minors. Now, when a minor is listed as a beneficiary, that money will go into a trust of some kind, and they won't have access to those funds until they're 18 or 21, the age of majority in that state. I don't imagine I'm too far different from a lot of other folks where, yes, it's good not to give a 13-year-old access to a bunch of money, but even when they turn 18, you might still want to exercise some more control as opposed to unfettered access. Lastly, another type of person that it might not make sense to outright bequest retirement account assets to are those who are benefiting from certain government programs. For example, a lot of the families we serve have loved ones with special needs, and the last thing you want to do is outright leave money to someone with special needs who's benefiting from certain government programs. This has nothing to do with whether or not they would perfectly manage these financial assets. It has all the more to do with the means-based testing that goes into qualifying for certain government programs. Things like SSI, Medicare, and Medicaid. Luckily, SSDI is not a means-based testing qualification, but odds are if they're qualifying for SSDI, they're probably going to get SSI and Medicare. And so for the most part, it just doesn't make sense to outright bequest money to someone with special needs. Now, specifically when it comes to leaving money in trust to a loved one with special needs, you're going to want to look into ensuring that they've established or are going to establish a special needs trust or a type 2 applicable multi-beneficiary trust. This is fairly new legislation in the estate planning space, so if at all you think you're in this situation where it would make sense to look into some trusts for folks with special needs, I would highly advise seeking out the guidance of an expert special needs estate planner. Keeping it simple though, these are trusts set up specifically to benefit those with special needs or those with chronic illnesses, whereby they can still benefit from a lot of great tax benefits from receiving these monies without kicking them off or jeopardizing their access to other government programs. All these scenarios are reasons why you might want to leave money in trust to the beneficiary as opposed to outright. In a previous video, I laid out what the required minimum distribution rules are for trusts and charities and estates. These are what are called non-designated beneficiaries, and for the most part, this is not the type of beneficiary you want getting access to a retirement account because they either have to liquidate the entire account in 5 years or the charity, trust, or estate must take out required minimum distributions based on the previous owner's life expectancy. And if they passed away at a fairly old age, then those required minimum distributions are going to be fairly accelerated. However, there are some trusts that are not considered non-designated beneficiaries and instead would qualify for far more liberal required minimum distribution treatment, which for the most part just means that your beneficiaries can obtain a longer tax deferral inside these retirement accounts and ideally pay as little in taxes as possible. These trusts are referred to as qualified see-through or qualified look-through trusts. In order for a trust to be qualified, there's at least 4 rules that have to be followed. Number 1, the trust has to be valid according to state law, which for the most part shouldn't be a problem if you work with a licensed estate planning attorney. Number 2, the trust must be irrevocable upon the death of the original owner. This should be outlined in the trust. Again, working with a competent estate planning professional, this shouldn't be a problem. Number 3, all the beneficiaries must be identifiable, which hopefully shouldn't be too hard to do, is essentially just locating who's going to get access to this money. And number 4, a copy of the trust needs to be provided to the IRA or retirement account custodian, which shouldn't be too hard because the only way you know what to do with this money is by reading the trust, which you should have a copy of. So let's fast forward and say, yep, you've determined that you can set up a qualified look-through or see-through trust. What are these? So they're essentially broken up into 2 main categories: Conduit Trusts and Accumulation Trusts. Now, normally, if you outright bequest money inside of a retirement account to a beneficiary, while they might have a required minimum distribution schedule that they should follow, theoretically, they could liquidate the entire account in year 1. That's where these trusts come in, is essentially to protect the beneficiary from doing that. Now, with either one of these trusts, you're going to establish a trustee, and that's the person that's going to be making decisions on behalf of the beneficiary. They'll have a fiduciary standard they need to follow, and there's going to be certain rules to follow as well. So let's first touch on conduit trusts. So I consider these non-accumulation trusts. It's a little bit easier to understand how they work. Conduit trusts must distribute the required minimum distribution from this retirement account to the beneficiary every year there's a required minimum distribution. AKA, the trustee can't decide not to send the beneficiary the required minimum distribution. The trustee might also have discretion to pull out more than the required minimum distribution if they deem it in the best interest of the beneficiary. For example, for most non-spouse beneficiaries, they'll need to follow what's called the 10-year rule. There may or may not be required minimum distributions in years 1 through 9, but what the 10-year rule dictates is that in year 10, the entire retirement account must be liquidated. I'll link above to my previous video on breaking down the 10-year rule in a little bit more detail. However, if there are no required minimum distributions in years 1 through 9, the conduit trust might say that the trustee doesn't have to pull out anything in years 1 through 9, and that account would just tax defer and compound, and in year 10 they'd have to fully liquidate the account. In an alternate scenario though, the trustee might decide, you know what, it's in the best interest of the beneficiary, maybe from a tax perspective in year 10, forecasting ahead of time, but they might decide it's in the best interest of the beneficiary to pull out a distribution every year in years 1 through 9, and then fully liquidate in year 10. Even though they don't have to, they might choose that that strategy is in the best interest of the beneficiary. Basically, conduit trusts do not permit assets to accumulate inside the trust, aka once a required minimum distribution is pulled out of the account, it can't sit and wait in the trust. It must be distributed by the end of the year. But the trustee might also have some freedom to pull out more than the RMD if they deem it to be in the best interest of the beneficiary. Okay, so that's conduit trusts. Let's talk about accumulation trusts. So accumulation trusts, on the other hand, do permit accumulation, as the name says. Just like a conduit trust, the trustee must withdraw a required minimum distribution from the IRA if ever there is one. However, that doesn't mean that they have to send the beneficiary the proceeds from that required minimum distribution. They are permitted to allow that money to sit and bake inside the trust. Of course, the trustee could send them that. They could send them more than the required minimum distribution if they wanted to, but most of the time these accumulation trusts are meant to accumulate long-term for the benefit of the beneficiary. Perhaps this retirement account is the only financial asset that this beneficiary has. With an accumulation trust, it might make the most sense to either send them a very small distribution over their life expectancy, or it might just make sense to hold on to these assets for at some point way in the future when it's needed. With a conduit trust, the money would have to be fully liquidated once it reaches the end of that required minimum distribution schedule. But with an accumulation trust, let's say the beneficiary was subject to the 10-year rule, the accumulation trust is allowed to continue and persist past year 10, holding on to all those retirement account proceeds. Now, of course, at that point, all the money is taken out of an IRA, so it's no longer achieving tax deferral, but the accumulation trust doesn't have to send distributions to the beneficiary. if the trustee deems it not in the beneficiary's best interest. For those of you who might have some experience working with trusts, this does mean that the trust will be subject to trust income tax rates on any income that the trust makes, which highest trust tax bracket today is 37%, plus any applicable state income taxes. Theoretically, income generated by the trust that stays within the trust could be taxed at 37-40% upwards, which is pretty confiscatory and not usually the most advantageous thing. However, if a case can be made that paying this very high income tax rate for retaining assets in the trust might be in the best interest of the beneficiary rather than giving the beneficiary that money. Bottom line, these accumulation trusts permit accumulation. Conduit trusts don't permit accumulation. So one question folks might be asking is, what required minimum distribution schedule must I follow if I am a beneficiary of one of these trusts? I'll cover that in a future video as it's a little bit nuanced, but to keep it super simple, if there's one beneficiary on this conduit or accumulation trust, then whatever beneficiary classification that beneficiary is what the trust must follow. So for example, if the beneficiary is considered an eligible designated beneficiary, and I'll link above as to what that qualifies as and who that would be, then the trust must follow eligible designated beneficiary required minimum distribution rules. Likewise, if the only beneficiary on the account is a non-eligible designated beneficiary, which is most people, then they'll need to follow the 10-year rule, which means they'll have to liquidate the entire account by year 10, and they may or may not have a required minimum distribution in years 1 through 9. Again, I'll link above to a previous video I did on that. Now, if there's multiple beneficiaries on this account, that's when things get a little bit more nuanced. We'll cover that in a future video. But hopefully that was helpful in breaking down the two main types of trusts that are used for beneficiary designations to trusts, namely qualified look-through trusts, known as conduit or accumulation trusts. If you have any questions, drop them in the chat below or get in touch on the website. We'll get you squared away. Have an awesome rest of your week. We'll chat with you later. Bye.